10 years ago, in January, I preached in another country. The church was located in Selangor, Malaysia, about an hour away from the nation's capital of Kuala Lumpur. One of the exciting things about attending the Asian Lutheran International Conference is the opportunity to experience worship and preach at a local congregation. I had done this a few times in Thailand and Indonesia, and each one was a fascinating experience. The church where I preached was a Mandarin-speaking congregation. Now, you might ask, why a Chinese congregation in Malaysia? The brief history is that when communism was on the rise in China in the 1940s, a group of Chinese immigrants resettled in Malaysia. And since Malaysia was primarily a Muslim country, the people to which the Christian missionaries were able to spread the good news of Jesus Christ were primarily the Chinese people. So when we talk about Christians in Malaysia, we're essentially talking about Malaysians of Chinese descent, although we now have Indians and people of other ethnic backgrounds. The church where I preached was the very first Lutheran church established by missionaries in Malaysia 73 years ago. So that Sunday morning at 8:15, I was standing in the hotel lobby with my pastor friend, Doris, who was to serve as my translator. Pastor Doris has an interesting background. She grew up in Singapore, studied in seminary in Thailand, and was serving a Lutheran congregation in Los Angeles, California. And she spoke several languages, including 3 Chinese dialects. Our driver who picked us up to get to our destination was Pastor Wang, the minister of the congregation. He drove a white van, which he called the gospel van, because it's used to pick up children, youth, and older people who are not able to come to church on their own. About 100 people regularly come to worship. Now, get this, 50% were young adults, and they were growing fast in number. And I'm thinking, we have a hard time getting young adults to be actively involved in church. What are they doing differently? Well, the difference is that they're living in a Muslim country where being Christian can be dangerous. Pastor Wang used the 2 words to describe what it was like: secret and underground. Those who were found to evangelize Muslims were sent to jail. So to live as a Christian in that kind of setting, one must really believe in living the kind of life that Jesus taught. The church created a community in which the young people were nurtured and the old people were cared for. Their music, led by young adults using keyboard and drums and guitar, is a blending of contemporary and traditional. That Sunday, they were commissioning the council officers or members of the vestry in Episcopal setting, and more than half were young adults. They were also commissioning the youth leaders and Sunday school teachers. As each big group came forward, someone prayed for them. Then they called the little children and those who have not been baptized. Each group that came up were prayed for by someone. And I got to pray for the little children. This church did a lot of praying. I think one of the best parts of our visit was getting to hear their personal testimonies after the service. Timothy, who drove us back to the hotel, was a 27-year-old member of the congregation, congregational council in charge of youth ministry. He worked for an advertising firm. Now, when he was 14, a Christian friend invited him to youth camp at the church. He loved it. That was his mountaintop experience. That was when he discovered Jesus in a community where people truly loved and cared for each other. And he wanted to keep coming to the church. He couldn't get enough of it. But his parents, who practiced animism and ancestral worship, wouldn't let him. They warned him that if he insisted on going to the youth camp, he would have to leave the house. Well, he was 14 and he couldn't do that. But 4 years later, he came back. He was older. And he said he had to because the Christian life offered something he couldn't get elsewhere. It gave his life meaning. This is a community where he feels most alive and fulfilled. This is a community where he is free to believe in a loving and living God. He was baptized and became actively involved in youth ministry. You know, the funny thing was that he was still living at home. His parents did not disown him after all, and he continued to pray for them just as a church prayed for him for those 4 years before he became Christian. Now, that's just one of the stories I heard. Somehow, through the outreach ministries of this hidden church, especially to non-Christians, people like Timothy were having mountaintop experiences that transformed their lives and point them in a new and bold direction than their parents and grandparents have ever experienced. Transfiguration is a turning point. It means a new way of seeing the world. It not only signals change, but it alters life's direction. It certainly did for Jesus. From being the only one to see the Holy Spirit descending and hearing the words from heaven, to having 3 of his closest friends hear the same words, naming him as God's beloved Son. The transfiguration comes at a turning point in Jesus' ministry. It happened 40 days before he was crucified. For Jesus, it affirmed him in his mission and sustained him for what was lying ahead, because from here on, Jesus heads towards Jerusalem, where suffering and death awaits him. For Peter, James, and John, who had begun to understand the real identity of Jesus as a Messiah, they were granted the vision of his glory, and they were transformed by the experience. But you know, transformation is hard. Change is hard. There's a human struggle that comes with change. It's much easier to stay the same, and it seems like the safer course of action. Perhaps that was why Peter suggested pitching some tents, so things could stay that way for a while. Perhaps he was afraid that if Jesus changes, then he could change, and that takes him out of his comfort zone. But the thing about tents is that they're not just about shelter. They also repel the forces of nature. They keep out that which might harm. They also keep as much in as they keep out. So sometimes our attempts to live in a tent and to play it safe can also keep out the opportunities that may be instrumental in our own spiritual growth. But transfiguration has a way of ripping our tents into shreds, as Carolyn Lewis would say. It has a way of exposing who we really are. It makes us vulnerable. But being vulnerable seems to be an essential part of living out our faith. Being vulnerable allows us to be open to God's vision of what could be. That is when the invisible world breaks through and we are in touch with the eternal, and we experience God speaking to us in a profound and personal way. Today is World Mission Sunday in the Anglican and Episcopal tradition. After Jesus rose from the dead, he commissioned his followers to go and make disciples of all nations. Now, if we separate come and mission, we get the concept of with mission. This mission that Christ has given us is to be done with him and not on our own. Traditionally, we might see mission work as teaching people about Christianity, especially in a foreign country, as the missionaries did in Asia and Africa and other parts of the world. But as the Secretary General of Anglican Communion, writes Reverend Anthony Pogo, says, the work of mission is so much more. It's also about living it and ministering in a holistic way that is meeting the physical and spiritual needs of the people. There are 5 marks of mission. They're abbreviated in 5 words, and they all start with the letter T. Tell, teach, tend, transform, and treasure. So to tell or proclaim the good news of God's kingdom, to teach, baptize and nurture new believers, to tend and respond to human need by loving service, to transform, and this is hard, transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind and pursue peace and reconciliation, and to treasure and strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. It kind of reminds us of our baptismal covenant, don't you think? But we don't even have to travel to a foreign country for mission. The world has come to us. We live in a multicultural world. We can simply share how God is active in our lives with someone who might need to hear it. God desires freedom and life for God's people, and that God is with us and for us through all things. As Jesus' disciples experienced, their mountaintop experience had a way of transforming the ordinary to the extraordinary. They would see in the ordinary events of life the person of Christ. A simple meal of bread and wine on a Thursday evening became a moment that was repeated again and again by the disciples to this very day. A walk along the road, a moment in a garden, going fishing. These were ordinary times that were transfigured to become moments of revelation. The ordinary act of breaking bread became a moment when the risen Christ was revealed. So as we approach the season of Lent, it is a time to reflect and look for Christ, not just in the spectacular things, but in the ordinary moments, such as cooking a meal for the family, visiting a friend who's sick, asking for help when you need it. It's a time to look at our own lives, our friendships, our relationships, and see where we can touch the holy. Discipleship is lived out in the ordinary encounters of life. The good news is that the light that blinds on the mountain is also the same light that shines to illumine our common life. Thanks be to God.